Battle of St. Albans, 1455 AD, the first blow that ignited the Wars of the Roses. Imagine a kingdom on the brink of collapse, where a mad king sits on the throne and two powerful families stand ready to tear England apart. How did a king crowned as a baby, with his mind lost to madness, become the pawn in a deadly game of power? Why did Richard, Duke of York, believe his claim to the throne was stronger than the king's himself? And what made Queen Margaret of Anjou, a fierce lioness in court, so determined to defend her husband's reign, even at the cost of plunging England into war? On May 22, 1455, the streets of St. Albans would witness the first bloodshed in a conflict that would last for decades. The Wars of the Roses. But how did this quiet town become the stage for such chaos? What daring plan allowed the Duke of York, with the audacious Earl of Warwick and the cunning Duke of Salisbury by his side, to outmaneuver the king's forces? As battle lines were drawn, what secrets, betrayals, and ambitions were about to explode into a bloody conflict that would forever alter the course of English history? Stay with us as we unravel the gripping tale of politics, treachery, and war that ignited one of England's deadliest civil wars. The First Battle of St. Albans, where one wrong step could shatter a dynasty forever. It was a day drenched in uncertainty, May 22, 1455. The Wars of the Roses, a conflict named for the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster, were about to begin with a savage force. The fates of kings, queens, and dukes would be decided not by courts or crowns, but by swords and arrows. But how did it all come to this? How did England, a land that had recently seen the glorious victories of Henry V, descend into civil war, where royal blood would be spilled so carelessly? To answer that, we must go back to the rise of the House of Lancaster. The Lancastrian family tree, like many noble houses, was a web of alliances, marriages, and ambition. It all began with John of Gaunt, the third son of King Edward III, who, through his marriage to Blanche of Lancaster, founded the House of Lancaster. The Lancasters were powerful, wealthy, and influential, but they lacked one thing: kingship. This changed in 1399 when John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, later known as Henry VI, seized the throne from his cousin Richard II after an audacious rebellion. It wasn't just a coup, it was the start of a dynasty. Henry IV's reign, though turbulent, secured the Lancastrian claim to the throne. His son, Henry V, would cement their legacy with his famous victories in the 100 Years' War, most notably the Battle of Agincourt, 1415. But the glory of the Lancasters wouldn't last forever. When Henry V died unexpectedly in 1422, the crown passed to his 9-month-old son, Henry VI. A child, a mere infant, was now King of England, and by a twist of fate, France as well. His reign was destined for trouble from the very beginning. Henry VI grew into a frail, pious man who preferred prayer and bookish pursuits to the rigors of kingship. And as fate would have it, he was plagued by a series of mental breakdowns, leaving him vulnerable to manipulation. England was rudderless under his rule. His inability to lead, combined with bouts of madness, made his reign a disaster waiting to happen. Enter Margaret of Anjou, a French princess with fire in her veins. Married to Henry VI in 1445 as part of a political agreement to end hostilities between England and France, Margaret quickly took charge when she realized that her husband was utterly incapable of ruling. Though still in her early 20s, she had a fierce will to defend her husband's reign at all costs. It didn't take long before whispers filled the court that it was Margaret, not Henry, who truly ruled the kingdom. Yet Margaret's forcefulness was a double-edged sword. She made powerful enemies among the English nobility, especially when she surrounded herself with unpopular advisors like Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Somerset, rumored to be Margaret's lover, wielded immense influence at court, but his mismanagement of military campaigns in France led to a series of humiliating defeats that enraged the English people. Margaret's French heritage didn't help matters either. The idea that an English queen of French descent was pulling the strings of power ruffled many feathers. But it wasn't until Margaret sidelined Richard, Duke of York, that the brewing tensions finally erupted. Richard, Duke of York, was no ordinary nobleman. He was a descendant of King Edward III through both his mother and father, giving him arguably a better claim to the throne than Henry VI himself. Richard had been a loyal servant of the crown for years, serving as protector of the realm during Henry's periods of mental incapacitation. But every time Henry regained his faculties, Margaret and her faction ensured Richard was pushed back into the shadows. For a man like Richard, that kind of treatment was intolerable. He wasn't just some lord to be discarded when no longer convenient. He had the blood of kings in his veins, and many in England thought him far more capable of ruling than the fragile Henry. The moment that triggered the conflict came in 1453, when Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown and fell into a catatonic state for over a year. Richard was named protector of the realm and ruled with the authority of a king. But when Henry suddenly recovered in late 1454, Margaret immediately began plotting to remove Richard from power. The political chess game was on. Margaret, determined to maintain control of the kingdom, ensured that Richard was stripped of his titles and influence. Enraged and humiliated, Richard raised an army in 1455 to confront the king and his advisors, specifically Somerset, whose arrogance and mishandling of affairs had made him a lightning rod for Yorkist anger. May 1455, England was teetering on the brink of civil war. At the heart of this political storm stood Richard, Duke of York, a man tired of watching the kingdom crumble under the weak and indecisive reign of Henry VI. For years, Richard had tried to play nice. He had offered advice, suggested reforms, and even tried to mentor the king. But when the crown is controlled by the likes of corrupt nobles, and the king's most critical decision each day is whether to have mutton or chicken for lunch, something drastic had to be done. Richard wasn't going to fight alone. His secret weapons? The indomitable Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, and the wise Duke of Salisbury, both of whom shared his frustration and hunger for change. Together, they raised an army of 3,000 men, a formidable force with one clear objective: march on London, confront the king, and demand the removal of his corrupt advisors. Let's dive into Richard's dream team for a moment. Warwick. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. This guy didn't earn the nickname the Kingmaker for nothing. Cunning, ambitious, and armed with more charm than a snake oil salesman, Warwick was the kind of man who could convince you to sell your house and thank him for the offer. His loyalty to the Yorkist cause wasn't just about power, it was about vision. He wanted a stable England, one where he had a significant role, of course. In this battle, Warwick's role was crucial. He rallied troops, strategized attacks, and, when necessary, didn't hesitate to get his hands dirty. His brain was as sharp as his sword, and both were about to be put to good use. Salisbury, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury. If Warwick was the charismatic go-getter, Salisbury was the sage, steady hand that ensured the plan didn't turn into a chaotic bar brawl. Older, wiser, and a veteran of many political battles, Salisbury was the cool-headed one, always thinking 5 moves ahead. He used his influence in the north to gather men, and his tactical mind was instrumental in turning Richard's ideas into reality. Together, these 3 men marched towards London, a city they hoped to claim not with bloodshed but with brains. But as we'll soon see, plans have a funny way of going awry. While Richard, Warwick, and Salisbury were gathering their army, King Henry VI was blissfully oblivious. The poor man could barely handle choosing what robe to wear, let alone run a kingdom on the brink of civil war. His court was filled with noble sycophants, more interested in padding their own pockets than in saving England. Among the worst offenders were his closest advisors, who manipulated the king's every decision. History isn't just about dates and facts, it's about stories. Stories of triumph, betrayal, love, and war that have shaped the world we live in today. By subscribing to our channel, you're not just following along, you're becoming part of these epic tales. Imagine being the first to dive deep into the dramatic rise of kings, the fall of empires, and the battles that turned the tides of history. You'll experience gripping narratives, unravel hidden plots, and see history come alive with every video we release. Each battle we cover holds lessons that echo in today's world, and by subscribing, you won't miss a single moment of these jaw-dropping, game-changing events. So hit that subscribe button, because together we'll not just witness history, we'll live it. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. As Richard and his men approached, Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford, the king's loyal but not particularly bright military commanders, scrambled to gather an army. They were under the illusion that a hastily thrown-together force of 2,000 men could fend off Richard's battle-hardened troops. Northumberland, for all his fiery temper and bravery, lacked the foresight to realize that you don't just throw up some barricades and hope for the best. Lord Clifford. Well, Clifford wasn't known for his strategic genius either. In fact, his tactical plan could be summed up in one word: panic. With the king's advisors breathing down their necks, they chose the town of St. Albans as the battlefield, more because it was convenient than because it made any sense. Before swords were drawn, there was a brief window where negotiations could have prevented bloodshed. Richard sent a message to the king: "Dismiss your corrupt advisors, and we'll all go home for tea." Simple enough, right? Well, in theory. In reality, it was more like Richard sent a letter saying, "Let's be reasonable," and Henry's camp responded with, "Let's not." King Henry, forever hopeful that things would just magically get better, refused to make any significant concessions. His advisors had convinced him that Richard's demands were a personal attack. So, when Richard's offer was refused, there wasn't much left to do except fight. And fight they did. Richard wasn't the type to sit around and wait for a peace treaty. If Henry's forces wouldn't budge, then he'd make them budge. He split his forces into two. One group, led by the fearless Warwick, would attack the barricades head-on, while the other would sneak around and find a weak spot in the Lancastrian defenses. Classic flanking maneuver. Simple, but effective. At 10 a.m. on May 22nd, the battle began. Warwick's men charged straight into the Lancastrian defenses at the eastern gate. At first, the Lancastrians held their ground, confident that their barricades would hold. But they hadn't counted on Warwick's ingenuity. He found a small, unguarded alleyway that led into the town. With a few men, Warwick breached the defenses, opening the floodgates for Yorkist forces to pour into the narrow streets of St. Albans. What followed was utter chaos. Imagine trying to fight a battle in streets so narrow that soldiers were practically tripping over each other. Swords clanged, arrows flew, and terrified townspeople hid in their homes, praying they wouldn't get caught in the crossfire. Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, fought valiantly to hold the line, but he was outmaneuvered by Yorkist forces. In the frenzy of the battle, Percy was struck down, falling in the street as his men scattered in panic. Soon after, Lord Clifford was killed, his desperate attempts to rally his troops ending in tragedy. Within a few hours, the Lancastrian defenses crumbled. York's forces pressed their advantage, sweeping through the town like a storm. Amid the chaos, King Henry VI remained, as always, lost in his own world. Shielded by his loyal bodyguards, he watched helplessly as his army fell apart around him. Finally, Yorkist soldiers breached his defenses, and Henry was captured. There was no dramatic showdown, no defiant speech, no final stand. Henry was simply taken, more like a bewildered bystander than a king. Dressed in simple robes, he was brought before Richard, Duke of York, who, to his credit, bowed in respect. But the message was clear: the power had shifted, and Henry was no longer in charge of his own destiny. By midday, the battle was over. The streets of St. Albans were littered with bodies, noblemen, soldiers, commoners, all caught in the whirlwind of a power struggle. Richard had won, but this victory was not just about defeating an enemy. It was about sending a message. The Yorkist claim to the throne was real, and they weren't going to sit idly by while the kingdom crumbled. As for Henry, he was now a pawn in a much larger game. His wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou, would not take this defeat lightly. Fueled by her ambition and fiery spirit, Margaret would rally the Lancastrian forces again. And thus, the Wars of the Roses had officially begun. A bloody, bitter civil war that would tear England apart for decades. So, what started as a skirmish in a small town turned into the opening act of one of the most brutal power struggles in English history. And Richard, with Warwick and Salisbury by his side, had set the stage for a battle that would echo through the ages. Richard's victory at St. Albans was swift, but it was also the first blow in what would become a long and bloody conflict. Though Henry VI was captured, Margaret's determination to keep her husband on the throne was unshaken. The Queen would regroup and continue to fight, leading to future clashes like the Battle of Teuton and the eventual ascent of Edward IV, Richard's son, to the throne. The battle taught a bitter lesson. When ambition and madness collide, kingdoms fall. Richard had proven his strength, but in doing so, he unleashed a civil war that would tear England apart for decades. And Margaret of Anjou, though defeated, would emerge as a formidable adversary, fighting for her son's inheritance with all the ferocity of a mother defending her cub. Coming up next, what if I told you that the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil didn't just decide a victory, it crowned a king? How did the young and daring Edward IV, the son of Richard, Duke of York, turn a chaotic, war-torn kingdom into his own empire? Why did the Battle of Teuton, a deadly clash in a snowstorm, become the turning point in the Wars of the Roses? What political maneuvers, betrayals, and deadly ambitions led to a battle where no mercy was given and no one dared surrender? Join us as we dive into the brutal struggle at Teuton, where the fate of the crown was sealed in blood, and the ascent of Edward IV shattered England's future. Don't miss out on this explosive chapter of history. Subscribe to our channel and get ready to witness the rise of a king.